everyone. I'm Mary Watson, Executive Dean at the New School, and it's my distinct pleasure and privilege and, dare I say, delight to host this event tonight, honoring the publication of our own Mark Lipton's book entitled, euphemistically speaking perhaps, Mean Men, the Perversion of America's Self-Made Man. So congratulations, Mark. I say it's deeply an honor to host this event and to get to open it tonight because I've known Mark for quite a number of years at the New School, and as I entered the room this evening, I see alums and friends and staff members and students from across the years. And so as we're getting started, and this might embarrass Mark slightly, just to honor Mark, could I ask those who were students of Mark Lipton to please stand? Thank you. We'd go through other groups related to Mark Lipton, but we'll leave that for the after party. So what you saw around the room tonight is a legacy of decades of leadership, teaching and learning, and imagination that Mark has brought to the New School, which most of you may know is a very imaginative and different kind of university. So the New School, as you may know, was founded nearly 100 years ago in 1919 by a group of scholars who left what they called the old school, Columbia University, to found a new university, one that was predicated on the idea of lifelong learning and engagement in the most pressing issues of the day, a place where learning would matter to the lives of those who were doing the learning, a place where activism and scholarship were not divorced from one another, but actually worked hand in hand to try to change the things that were troubling us in our times. This was 1919, which was right around the period of World War I, and as you probably don't recall but may have read, that time period there was a movement for various individuals, but in this case university faculty, to sign a loyalty oath agreement to the U.S. government because of the rising fascism in Europe. And 6 scholars left Columbia University. Among them were John Dewey, the founder and made famous individual around experiential education and aesthetics and learning, to found the New School here nearly 100 years ago. So in the 1930s, the New School was opened something called the University in Exile, which was a program to harbor scholars who were being persecuted by rising fascism. 180 scholars and their families were brought, mostly Jews from Europe, to New York City to preserve and advance their scholarship and to be held safe in haven from the rest of the world. Now, that all sounds like a very long time ago, except when you think for a moment about the time that we're in. And listen to the silence in the room. You think about the moment, about the time that we're in, where we perhaps, sadly, could not imagine a more timely topic than the conversation of what it means to be a mean man in 2017. The New School has been the first in many, many arenas. It's offered some of the first courses in important fields. We claim to have offered the first U.S. American courses in African-American studies and in women's studies. We've had iconoclastic faculty and public intellectuals here, including W.B. Du Bois and Margaret Mead and Eric Fromm and Martha Graham and Frank Lloyd Wright and James Baldwin and Grace Paley and Martin Luther King Jr. and, dare I say, Mark Lipton. And over this very long period of time and in this long legacy, students among us have marched across the graduation stages and have experienced a lifetime of legacy of nearly 100 years of trying to make a difference in education in the world. So just a couple of words about Mark and this book. So this Mean Men book, as I indicated earlier, really couldn't come at a more complicated time, which no doubt delights the publisher and maybe makes Mark's interviews more complicated, because Mean Men seem to be having a bit of a moment as we look around. And I quote from the book's introduction, America loves a winner, especially the guy who forged his own path, the tech entrepreneur, the Hollywood mogul, the rags to riches politician, the driven athlete, the 2016 self-proclaimed winner and real estate mogul who won the presidency and was named Times Person of the Year. Pass any newsstand and you'll see their faces, mostly male, mostly white, on magazine covers. Social media eats them up and they're the darlings and demons of Twitter. But there's another side to many of these talented individuals, a side too many of us like to ignore. These leaders are often just out for themselves. They step on others to get ahead. They are deceptive and ruthless. They have explosive tempers and abusive personalities, and in a word, they are mean. And so tonight we're going to hear a little bit about what Mark means by those words, about the timing of this book's publication, and what meanness means in executive leadership, in government, and entrepreneurship, and in other facets of our society, and to ask ourselves why meanness seems to have become an organizing principle of our nation's approach to thinking about leadership. Now, I'm proud tonight that we're hosting this event at the New School, because the New School is very decidedly anti-mean and anti-mean men. So we are very excited to reinforce the idea that for decades, Mark has been teaching and leading courses in group process and group dynamics and humanistic leadership and creative engagement in different kinds of industries in order to find ways to bring out the most human, the most sensible, the most sensitive, and the most effective of all of us. And in fact, our management programs aspire to do that more broadly across the university, now bringing together the fields of design and social entrepreneurship, executive leadership, social engagement and social innovation, and also the areas of media and management and creative writing, bringing the aesthetic arts into this field. So I think it's because Mark has been at the New School and been consulting outside the New School that he can see this interaction of these two archetypes of what leadership looks like. And as Mark said to a colleague of mine before this event, and I quote, "What other business school would have faculty who would write about things like this?" So he's very happy to be at the New School to be able to find a place where this kind of discourse is welcome and really embraced. So in closing, I just want to say that we're very excited about having Mark's book launch here. Mark has been Milano's chair of the management programs. He's served in that role for over 22 years. He launched the Tenenbaum Leadership Initiative, Leading After Legacy, which I had the privilege of co-teaching with him and with Sandy Bowers, who's here in the audience tonight. Mark is a trusted advisor to Fortune 500 companies, to think tanks, to philanthropy, to not-for-profits, and to startups. He has a diverse entrepreneurial client base. His coaching skills at the C-level are unparalleled. He has done board development. He's done multi-billion-dollar philanthropic game-changing consulting. But mostly, he's tried to remind us that progressive leadership practice is what matters in a world that's trying to make a difference. So let me close by saying, Mark, it's really exciting to be here tonight. Congratulations.
Thank you, Mary. That was a very generous introduction. And I'm so touched to see so many students I haven't seen in not years, but decades. And I thank Mary, I thank Michelle DePass, the Milano Dean, I thank the entire university that's been very supportive of me in my 38 years at this place. I've really enjoyed it. And I'm really grateful so many of my family have come out. This is like better than my bar mitzvah. Underneath your seats, and I see most of them missing, which is a good sign, but underneath your seats is an index card with a pen. And the way we will handle questions and answers at the back end of the program is by you offering up something that gets evoked in you by the conversation. And the benefit of using this technology to voice your question is that it enables you to ask something that you may be uncomfortable standing in front of a microphone in front of, I don't know how many, 150, 200 people. So use anything that comes up during my comments, during my colleagues' panel's comments. Please capture it as a question on the index card, and some of my colleagues will be walking around collecting them. So tonight is a milestone, not for me, but it's a milestone for a movement. I hope we discover shared interest, and I hope we feel compelled to take action. But let's first define the problem. There is a force that's corrosive to our institutions and our culture. It's a problem that I believe is toxic to our country. We have a problem with mean men in leadership. And we have a problem where we have to find ourselves with men in a variety of entrepreneurially fueled professions that are leading, but they're leading in ways that are certainly antithetical to the way we define leadership, how we teach leadership here, and how we develop leaders. They tear down rather than build up. They tear down people, they tear down institutions, they are controllers, and they are exploiters. And this self-made man is pathologically motivated only to get his own needs met. But before diving in to understand the mean man and the collateral damage he creates, a bit of backstory. This journey began, well, here, from about 15th Street up to 23rd, from 8th Avenue over to Broadway. It was the late 1990s, and it was called Silicon Alley. It was the first dot-com rush. It was the first big spurt of digital media firms popping up all over the place. And young founders were conjuring grand and compelling visions of how they thought they could change the world. It was also a period of shifts in the economics of startups that was profoundly changing. Barriers to entry were dropping quickly. The costs of technology were plummeting. Angel investors, venture capital investors had boatloads of money just sloshing around, ready to invest. But these investors wanted a quick return, which meant these young firms had to grow quickly and get to an IPO very quickly so the investors could get their return. So they were wagging their finger at these young founders and telling them to get big fast. On top of this, there was a free agent nation dynamic unfolding. If you had a great idea, you no longer had to pay your dues at working at some big mothership of a company before striking out on your own. The days of organizational man were disappearing. My own consulting practice had already transitioned to coaching CEOs and other senior executives, so it wasn't too difficult for me to pivot, to begin coaching these younger tech founders. They needed help, and quite honestly, I was intellectually intrigued. I really wanted to understand who were these young guys? How did they organize this? How did they get these organizations standing up so quickly? I worked with them, but after a few months, as more and more were on my roster, there was a distinctive characteristic among some of them, certainly not all. There was a dark side. For obvious reasons, I can't show pictures of the guys I worked with, but what I can do is put up a proxy for the kind of guy who I think characterizes who I did work with. So we have Travis Kalanick. And Kalanick is just today's incarnation of the kind of guys that I was working with back in the 90s. While initially charming, charismatic, they could become profoundly unlikable characters. They could be abusive and controlling to employees, deceitful to investors and vendors, ruthless, and with narcissistic tendencies that were way too complex for me to understand. As repulsed as I was by these guys, I was drawn to understand what was I seeing, what was I thinking, what was I feeling about their behaviors. And this, I promised myself, would be my next research project. I had committed to doing a book at that point. I researched it, wrote it, got it out in 2003, and by 2000, okay, thank you. By 2008, I was ready. One thing I was sure of, though, I really needed help. I needed help understanding this complicated phenomena, which I knew went deeply into psychology. And in 2009, I got that chance to begin the deep dive into mean. I had a moment of serendipity in 2008. I saw an announcement in an academic publication for something called the Erickson Scholar in Residence Program at the Austin Riggs Center. Here, one of the highest rated psychiatric hospitals on the continent, offering 4 months of support and freedom to explore an idea and to make the best use of the brilliant minds on their clinical staff. They were open to people like me, without psychology backgrounds, and in fact, they encouraged transdisciplinary research. I applied, and I was ecstatic to get the gig. So in 2009, January, I left the New School for a number of months and moved up to the campus of Austin Riggs, which is in Norman Rockwell's town of Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And on the first day I started as an Erickson scholar, I met with the director of the Erickson Institute. And the Institute is the research and clinical training arm of Riggs. And he said, you know, I'd like to talk to you for a bit, Mark, just to get you going and give you some orientation. And I appreciated those words of wisdom of how to make the most of my Erickson scholar role for the limited few months even that I had. But I had a question for him. What was on my mind was, why did they choose this topic that clearly was behind what I wanted to do? What was there about the topic? Because I didn't think there was that much about me that I was bringing to the party. And he thought about it, and it was clear that his answer was known. This was not something that he had to put together. And he said, you know, we have a good measure of interest in what you're probing, Mark. Some of our patients come to us for help, and they're from very high-achieving families, often with driven fathers, whose stress plays itself out in their relationship with both their spouses and their children. So the more you can answer your questions and understand what's behind their behavior, the better we may be to understand the parental influence that perhaps helped to shape these patients. And that'll give us a better sense of what they're struggling with. That was the moment I realized this was a problem that had far-reaching implications way beyond what I've ever imagined. And it brought a question to me leaving his office. I thought, my God, had I created some cloistered professional world of organizations and management and leadership where I just couldn't see the wider implications of this? So it was in that instant that I realized this was not just a workplace issue. But of course, the folks at Riggs already knew that. Job one when I got to Riggs in January 2009 was the need to understand what is behind the entrepreneur. How do we profile them in terms of their personality characteristics? And I dug into the academic research for about 6 weeks, and it was messier than I expected, so had to clean a lot of data out. But what I was able to do was come up with a list of characteristics that male entrepreneurs exhibited, and these characteristics were significantly higher than for men in the general population of our culture. So I call it 10 plus T, the 10 characteristics that these entrepreneurs exhibit, and you could probably guess what the T is. Entrepreneurs show a higher level of testosterone than men in the general population. So I started focusing on these characteristics. All of them were important to me. All of them were contributing to me understanding the mean man. But I wondered, what happens if just these characteristics get bumped up a bit? If 2 of them they're already above normal, what if they're dialed up a little more? Would we start seeing hyper-driven needs for control? Could impulsivity run amok? Might there be pathological issues around their inability to trust other people? Could that account for why partnerships that start as entrepreneurial startups rarely ever last as partnerships? Were these men predisposed to take big risks? And was there a warped sense of self-confidence, some narcissistic neediness? And yet, they are seen by many as highly charismatic leaders. More importantly, I started realizing that not all cranky, aggressive, controlling, entrepreneurial men were starting to fit this construct of mean that was coming into view. And the next slide, with the individual on it, gives me a little chance for some of that insight. Who's this guy? It's Bill Gates. It's young Bill Gates. So this tells us a few things. It tells us also another finding from research about 3.5 years ago, which is fascinating, that one of the most reliable predictors of a man becoming an entrepreneur is social deviance. Not criminality, but deviance from an accepted social norm in their late teen years, in their early adulthood years. Not every entrepreneur, but it turns out right now to be the most predictive characteristic of somebody going into entrepreneurship. I think it was Abe Zalesnik, the psychoanalyst who taught at Harvard Business School, who passed away a few years, and Abe said, you can only understand the entrepreneur by truly understanding the juvenile delinquent. So not all cranky entrepreneurs are mean. And toward the back end of my time at Riggs, I took a trip back to New York and I had set up a meeting with a senior editor of a leading business magazine. And I had gotten her intrigued about the idea ahead of time. I wasn't looking for press, I was looking for her insight. And we just started talking about entrepreneurs who became big. And she asked, what do you think about Bill Gates? And I said, you know, I don't think he's mean. I think he's cranky and controlling and he's difficult in meetings and I've read a lot, but he's not mean. And she said, I agree with you. I really agree with you. I said, I think Gates has changed. He seems to have become more whole. I've noticed his behavior, just how he talks. And I don't read those scary articles I used to read anymore. And she nodded her head and she said, I agree. And she thought for a moment and said, have you spoken to Melinda Gates? And I'm thinking, not in my social circle. So I said, no, I've not had that opportunity. What would Melinda say about this? She said, well, I've spoken to Melinda a number of times. I've done a piece on Melinda. And Melinda was a powerful influence in changing Bill Gates, in sanding down those sharp elbows. She really made him whole. And I took that with the gravity in which I heard it. And it really identifies a number of items that we'll talk about tonight, but one of them is that Bill Gates isn't mean because he has the capacity to adapt. And as we'll see a little later, the mean man can't. He can't adapt in large part because of what he's struggling with. So I kept playing around with these variables, and then I thought, what if these are really dialed up? What if 4 of these really get cranked up? And the image that came in my mind was those old analog temperature gauges that were on the dashboard of our cars. And the temperature would go up as the engine heated up, and there was that red zone. And the needle would get close, and you got worried if the needle was heading into the red zone. And somehow that image stayed in my mind as I started thinking about what happens if we crank these up. And then it became clear to me, and it was a scary day in my office at Austin Riggs, when I realized that the implications of cranking these up met the clinical criteria for a troubling personality disorder. To be clear, to be very clear, I am not going to arbitrarily, recklessly toss around the name of a disorder. I will name the disorder. And hopefully get all of you interested in learning more about it. So the disorder is known as psychopathy. And specifically to mean men, in my understanding, it is subclinical psychopathy. They are high functioning generally, yet they present the criteria for someone at a distance anyway, who is not capable of making a diagnosis, to reach that conclusion. So the theme running through most disorders is, as I mentioned, the inability to adapt. And most of us have heard that hackneyed definition of craziness, where you keep repeating the same behaviors over and over again, expecting different outcomes. But in fact, with serious personality disorders, there's some dose of truth to that, accuracy. And in fact, what these people do is essentially double down on the same behaviors, thinking, I'll just do more of that. That might lead to a better outcome. So when I really cranked these up, the personality traits got dialed up, and then started seeing some of the criteria for psychopathy. An obsession with control, an inability to empathize with others, an inability to feel key emotions that the rest of us experience, like love. It is impossible for them to feel those emotions. They do feel what are called proto-emotions. They're primitive responses to very immediate needs. They may feel depression and sadness, but at much weaker levels than we do. They require ever-increasing levels of stimulation to keep them going, to keep them standing up. And there's an emergence of what is known as malignant narcissism. Now, about a decade ago, criminal activity, up until a decade ago, criminal activity was actually part of the diagnostic criteria for psychopathy, and it was removed. So that may explain why we are hearing more about this disorder, and why there's far more research going on and that we're reading in the academic literature, very good research, and also why we're hearing more about it, at least in the higher quality press right now. So what's the problem? The problem is we are deifying the abusive entrepreneur. We are mythologizing a culture of free agency that lacks personal accountability. We're elevating toxic masculinity. And that's creating a problem for men, and it's creating a different problem for women. I've identified 6 types of mean men. Like all of us, we're not the same. With any disorder, it manifests itself in very different ways. And with mean men, they act differently. Their meanness comes out in different ways. I'm just going to give you a sample, and I'm not going to even go through all 6. This is Mr. Two-Face. I call him Mr. Two-Face because with this type of display of the disorder, there's a facade of caring and empathy. If you don't know him, this is Jerry Sandusky, convicted serial rapist, child molester, retired football coach at Penn State. And during his trial, he said in the courtroom, with seeming honesty and feeling, I really care about young men. I really care about their healthy development. So there is that facade that's quite strong. Another one is, I call the opportunist. By the way, I give extraordinary credit to this list to Theodore Millon, a late personality psychologist, who has studied psychopathy in great depth. And some of his work has been enormously helpful to me to create these typologies. So the opportunist, Lance Armstrong, most of us know this guy, Tour de France biker, a record 7 consecutive times from 1999 to 2005. However, all his wins going back to August 1998 have been voided. He's a doper. But being a doper and using performance-enhancing drugs doesn't make him mean. He's nearly a pathological achiever. That does not make him mean. But for those who made his wins possible, for those who trusted him, who gave up so much to enable him to win, they were rewarded by being lied to. And in many cases, their lives were absolutely destroyed by Lance Armstrong. The opportunist expects recognition and privilege just for being who he is. unscrupulous, amoral in relationships, unafraid to humiliate or deceive other people just to get what he wants. I don't know if you caught it, but if you did, recall that what was supposedly the big reveal on Oprah, when he was going to come on and tell all about his wayward behavior. I watched it, and I noticed it was basically, I got caught. There was a complete lack of contrition. There was no remorse. And watching his nonverbals, there was nothing to indicate that he felt bad about what he did and what he did to other people. The opportunist is controlling, manipulative, and would throw almost anybody under the bus. This is the hothead. Harvey Weinstein, co-founder with his brother Bob of Miramax and other film production companies. The hothead is infamous for adult tantrums, attacks on others, rage, sudden displays of hostility. Only about a month ago, I was reading something about Weinstein, and a film reviewer commented about him, and I quote, "He can be cruel and abusive, but look at the great works of culture he's given us." And that goes to the core that Mary alluded to of what are we dealing with in this culture in terms of acceptance of the mean man. Look at the great works of culture. So do comments like this actually normalize this egregious kind of behavior? Another type I call the cowboy, and the cowboy takes big, impulsive risks. This is Mark Driscoll. Driscoll was founder of Mars Hill Church in Seattle. At its peak, megachurch, at its peak, he had 13,000 attendees, 15 locations. He could fill the Seattle Seahawks stadium within less than a week when he put the word out. It was not his misogynistic and disgusting sexual interpretations of the Bible that made him mean. It was his abuse of power. He took big risks to continue expanding his flock, and they backfired. So cowboys are risk-taking thrill junkies, and they ultimately look more stupid rather than courageous. And though he was taken down, he really damaged people. He damaged many people who were his congregants. And as we see in many organizations, there were people who knew what he was doing. The elders of the church were aware of his abuse of power. The last one I'll share is Mr. Dissatisfaction. Mr. Dissatisfaction feels as though life has never given him his due. He feels deprived. He remains at his core insecure about his power, insecure about his possessions. He's pushy, he's greedy, he's a poster boy for conspicuous consumption. So, just an appetizer of some of the types and the ways we can look at mean men. They are not all the same in terms of how they behave. So I was still left with, why do people stay with these guys? What is it? They become part of a group, whether a church or a business or a political movement. Why do they stay with someone who is controlling and abusive and holds a lot of other pretty ugly personality characteristics and, more importantly, horrible behavior? What psychological dynamics are acting on these groups of individuals? What do they see in their leader? So I found insight from the work of Bion, the influential British psychoanalyst. And he saw that many group members have fantasy needs. They have shared basic assumptions that are largely unspoken. They don't talk amongst themselves about these assumptions. The individuals may be very diverse, but when they come together, they fall under the spell of someone who they perceive meets their needs. And these groups fall into three related categories. So there are three categories that helps us understand why these people stay. And individuals in each group can succumb to this dynamic. It enables the mean man to seem adept at superficially meeting some of their fantasy needs. And maybe the operative word is superficially. The first one, let's take a look at how this works. The first one is called the dependency need. With the dependency group, leadership is less about the charismatic appeal of the leader, but more about getting to feel good about what they want to hear from that person. It's a cult of personality, usually built on loyalty through the means of communication, and typically verbal communication. This type of individual gets his audience to emote. And even watching films historically with leaders who lead these dependency groups, the words they use get people to nod with what they're saying. They're also, and historically, they are meme dependent in how they communicate. Lock her up. Second group is called the pairing group. Walter Isaacson did a great biography on Steve Jobs, but he didn't elaborate on the worst of Jobs. And what he didn't tell us was, what are the needs that Jobs fulfilled for those who continued to take his abuse? And Isaacson did touch on a lot of the abusive sides of Jobs. Living under Jobs was infamously known as the reality distortion field. And within that reality distortion field of Steve Jobs was a dynamic known as the hero shithead roller coaster. And the hero shithead roller coaster worked like this. If you worked closely with Steve and you had an idea or you had insight to something, you'd you'd saddle up to him in the elevator, you'd walk along the hallway with him, you might have an appointment with him, but invariably, in fact, most of the time, disproportionately, you would be told by Steve that you were a complete shithead and it was the stupidest idea he's ever heard. The hero part of this is that usually 2 or 3 days later, you'd be in a meeting and you would hear almost verbatim your idea, your insight, your solution to something. What made them stay, though? The pairing group may give us answers to that. Here in the pairing group, the group is looking for a savior. They're looking for a messiah. So when Jobs came back to Apple, he was the last hope for this failing organization on its last legs. They cared so deeply about Apple, about the survival and the revival of Apple, that unconsciously they gave themselves over to Steve. Forget that he failed the first time at Apple. Forget that he failed in the startup Next, which he followed after Apple. People who stayed with him were able to say, I will take what he's dishing out because I care so much. So it is sad that Steve Jobs died. We'll never know. There are many reasons it's sad, but one thing is that we will never know if his success was an anomaly for a mean man. Would he have been taken down eventually, again? The final group that helps us understand why do people stay. This is Dov Charney, if you have not met him. He was the founder of American Apparel, once a great manufacturing and retail story in America. And American Apparel went down in flames. Charney sexually abused, sexually harassed women who worked at American Apparel. At least to my count, he settled 6 suits privately. With men, he was more physically abusive, violent at times. But Charney was politically progressive, if you listen to him. He was committed to not only manufacturing in America, but providing well-paid jobs, particularly to immigrants. So what's the charm? What's the appeal? The fight-flight dynamic, which this group Charney represents, the fight-flight leader appeals to the fears of his base. So here, the promise to protect American manufacturing jobs, to protect immigrants, and give them the opportunities and not deportation, interestingly, today to mention that. This was a powerful assumption that the people working there didn't want to happen. And everyone there believed in it. They believed in that meta cause of American apparel. And oddly, the mostly white middle-class executives were immune to immigration. But he got them to join in the fight-flight dynamic that he churned up. So what does a mean man look for? You know, he may be emotionally numb, significantly one down on many dimensions of emotional maturity. But one thing he does know is how to look for vulnerabilities in people. And there are certain characteristics, most importantly, that he looks for. A very high need, others with a very high need for approval, a high level of self-doubt, low tolerance for conflict, a strong desire to keep the peace, a fear of anger. And in some people, their vulnerability is the tendency to take responsibility for other people's lives. All right, this is getting really dark. Let's brighten this up a bit here. What's the solution? The solution is in a few people who, for me, are really emblematic of where our solution is to the mean man. This is Paul Graham. Paul is the co-founder of Y Combinator, a digital startup incubator, probably one of the most successful startup incubators in this country. He's funded over 1,000 startups. And Paul has said, you know, we just don't want to spend our time working with people we can't stand. They have an ethos at Y Combinator, an ethos that says you can be nice and succeed. He has not invested $1 in anyone closely resembling the kind of guys we talk about this evening. And hearing him really excited once, talking about what it's like bringing entrepreneurs who have been through the incubation process. They've grown successful organizations, and there are some very big organizations that started there. And they always come back for these workshop reunions for the current younger folks about to do their startup. And what amazes Paul, which does not amaze me, is he's always impressed at the extraordinary level of trust, the willingness to help one another, from very successful entrepreneurs to those barely starting out yet. You know, Paul's also said, good people are more likely to have an authentic vision rather than being motivated merely by money or power. Somebody else who, for me, presents part of the solution in a different sector. Sometimes the solution is seeing the results from someone who really is civil, someone who can access that most human of traits, empathy. This is Steve Kerr. Steve is a 7-time National Basketball Association player, winner. For the last few years, he's been head coach of the Golden State Warriors, and they have been national champions 2015 and this year, 2017. You know, only a week ago, I was reading about Steve, and a commentator said in a piece, he said, it wasn't about Steve, it was about the team, because I was really curious how this plays itself out at the team level. And the commentator said, the Seahawks seem to be having more fun than any other team I've seen. Kerr is an extraordinarily empathetic coach. He knows that sports are an active ingredient of American culture. He knows, maybe better than other coaches, that players are complicated. They are molded by their backgrounds, their race, their religion, their circumstances. He gets the nuance of the human condition. And just maybe, that might be because of a bit of his own history. Steve Kerr was born in Beirut, Lebanon. His father was Malcolm Kerr, the president of the American University of Beirut. And in 1984, when Malcolm Kerr was 52 and Steve was 18, his father was shot point blank in the head by a jihadist and died instantly. Before my father was killed, Steve said, my life was impenetrable. Bad things only happen to other people. That was before. So there's a term that some of us use in teaching leadership. It's called a twice-born leader. And Steve Kerr is probably a twice-born leader, in large part because of this trauma that he went through at a young, impressionable age. He could have turned very different. He could have turned out to be a very angry, mean man, but he didn't. And Steve Kerr is a winner. Solution is in people like Diana Holmes. She was bullied, intimidated by that megachurch founder I mentioned a few slides back, Mark Driscoll. She formed coalitions at Mars Hill Church among congregants. She knew her power was not by herself. Her power was not going to the elders. Her power was in forming coalitions, and it worked. So after Driscoll was basically run out of town, a year ago, he bought a church in Scottsdale. And Diana found out about it and went down to Scottsdale, and every Sunday, she's out there with that placard marching on the sidewalk in front of Mark Driscoll's church. That's part of the solution. Part of the solution is in very successful entrepreneurs. This is Mark Benioff. He founded an outfit called Salesforce.com, now simply called Salesforce. In 2016, he was named one of the world's 50 greatest leaders by Fortune magazine for his commitment to social issues. This is a CEO who does much more than lip service about social issues, perhaps unlike Dov Charney, perhaps unlike him. Barron's has put Benioff among the best CEOs in the world, and Forbes has named his organization one of the most innovative companies 5 years in a row. He's a leader in gender equity in tech. He's a corporate leader in social justice issues. And organizationally, as a leader, he has built a culture where people not only want to work, they want to innovate. They want a place that has a startup feel all the time to it, a very healthy startup feel. So there are some of us who might say that Mark Benioff is undisruptible. And arguably, he probably is among the top undisruptible CEOs in our country today. This problem, this is a societal problem, and so is the solution. First step is creating awareness. We need to do a few things. We need to uncover and understand the degree to which mean men are taking leadership roles in important facets of our society. We need to accept that mean does not work in any sustainable way, in any institution, and there are piles of data now to back this up. We have to create a cultural awareness that goes beyond seeing mean men as just aggressive guys. Their condition is corrosive to the institutions in our culture. But there's a second step, and the second step is holding institutions accountable. For business, it's the boards, it's the investors. For nonprofit, it is also boards and those that fund the nonprofit organizations. For public office, it's all of us as voters. For sports, sure, it's the fans, but as we've seen, sadly, in college sports and university sports, it's the administration that has to be held responsible. I think it's only in the last year that Penn State administrators were convicted because of what went on there with the coach I showed earlier. For religious figures, it's the congregation and it's the governing bodies. We have to stop. We have to stop thinking this is the price of success. We have to stop mythologizing mean men. We have to stop believing that what might look like success with mean most often is just short-term, and it's almost always destructive. We've got to start understanding the power we have as consumers of products and services, seeing the behavior of the brand is the brand. Seeing the behavior of the brand is the brand. So when Kalanick responded, I think irresponsibly as CEO to the New York Taxi Workers Alliance 1-hour strike, the day that Trump instituted his immigration ban, and had told all the Uber drivers to rush to JFK to not charge surge pricing, we were watching the behavior of the brand. So while it appeared that they were trying to break the strike, we'll never really know the truth. But what's important was how people responded. Thousands and thousands of people deleted their Uber app, and most of them have not loaded it back up. They never came back. And it really was that moment that was the beginning of the downfall of Travis Kalanick, ultimately being fired, which nobody thought could happen either. So this movement is budding already. What we need to do is elevate the discussion about mean men. We have to take the actions that are available to all of us. And I'd like to conclude my comments with the last 2 lines of my book. A new model of leadership, one that eschews mean and builds on trust and collaboration and responsibility, is indeed what is needed. Let's start now. Thank you. Thanks. So if I could get my debris out of here, if I could ask the panelists to join me up on the staging, and I will introduce them to you. Also, some of my colleagues will be walking around collecting the index cards if you have them. And since we are live streaming, we don't know to how many people. Let's give the live streamers a chance. So tweet in, and we'll take questions at the end. Hello.
Hello.
So I am humbled by the guests on our panel this evening, and I'd like to introduce them closest to me and out. Vanessa Furmans is a staff reporter at the Wall Street Journal, where she writes about management and workplace issues, including the shifting roles and the challenges facing business leaders. As an 18-year-old, yeah, that too. As an 18-year veteran at the Journal, Vanessa's covered an array of topics, from America's uninsured to the run-up to Obamacare, to how companies and their CEOs are navigating the Trump presidency. She's also served 2 tours as a foreign correspondent, first in Frankfurt and later in Berlin, during which she wrote about businesses' efforts to grapple with Europe's debt crisis and Germany reluctantly assuming the mantle of Europe's leader. Prior to the Journal, Vanessa was a correspondent for Bloomberg News, and she has a Master of Science from Georgetown's Walsh School of Foreign Service. Next to Vanessa is Jerry Fromm, and Jerry is a psychoanalyst. Hello. Jerry is a psychoanalyst and an organizational consultant, and he's distinguished faculty member and former, and I'll say this loud until the mic comes back on, former director of the Erickson Institute of the Austin Riggs Center in Stockbridge. So the gentleman I referred to earlier, who gave me a wonderful first day orientation, and to whom I asked the question, why are you interested in this topic? This is the guy. Jerry is also an assistant clinical professor. Is this me? Okay. Also an assistant clinical professor in the Yale Child Study Center. Jerry's taught at and consulted to a number of psychoanalytic institutes across the country. He's president of the International Dialogue Initiative, an interdisciplinary group that studies the psychodynamics of societal conflict. And he's got it. Okay. Past president of both the International Society of Psychoanalytic Study of Organizations and the Center for the Study of Groups and Social Systems in Boston. Jerry has directed or served on the staff of group relations conferences in the United States, Canada, Europe, and Israel. He's presented and published widely, including mostly A Spirit That Impels, Play, Creativity, and Psychoanalysis. And lastly, but certainly not least, Sylvia Beshevkin. Sylvia is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. She's the author of Women as Foreign Policy Leaders, which is about to come out from Oxford University Press. And she's editing a volume on female political executives in the Canadian provinces and territories. Her distinctions are long, I will abbreviate. They include a fellowship in the Royal Society of Canada, the Mildred Schwartz Lifetime Achievement Award in Canadian Politics from the American Political Science Association, and the Gender Studies Award from the Royal Society. I will not list all of your books, Sylvia, I'm sorry. Just some that really caught my eye and in relevancy to me and my interests. Among her many books, Women, Power, Politics, The Hidden Story of Canada's Unfinished Democracy, Welfare Hot Buttons, Women, Work, and Social Policy Reform, and the last one I'll mention, Women on the Defensive, Living Through Conservative Times. So, thank you all. And we were chatting about how to organize the evening. And a wonderful idea bubbled up from the panelists, which was just to spend a few minutes each in terms of reaction to anything in the book, reaction to this evening, just wherever you are and from wherever you're coming from, and to take a few minutes. And Vanessa, if I could ask that of you first.
Okay. Okay, it's working.
I just wasn't.
Yes. So yes, thank you, Mark. I'm actually very humbled to be a part of this panel because I feel like I'm the one member who doesn't come at this from a rigorous approach. My approach is simply journalism, not fake news, just journalism. So I'm just going to bring up a couple of observations that I've come across in the time I've covered management issues. And I would like to say I cover management issues from a pretty broad perspective, not just how leaders in the corporate world manage their companies, but also increasingly how employees are responding to their leadership, which I think is really an ever bigger part of this whole equation that you brought up. And as Mark was speaking, I thought nearly every point you raised is touched in some way or another on a story I've covered or written, and that's really just in the last 6 months. So I think this is an incredibly relevant issue, and it's a fascinating framework to look at what's going on, particularly in business and entrepreneurship. So I'm just going to bring up a few thoughts and try to thread them together as best I can. First of all, what I think is a key condition for probably this whole mean man phenomenon, in the way at least I've seen it, is a very scientific term you brought up, and it was boatloads of money. I think if you want to see where a mean man is going to thrive, it's probably where you have to follow the money, which we say all the time in the news business. If you recall Steve Jobs, before he became the greatest second act in the history of business, he was booted from Apple, and that was because, despite being this hard-charging entrepreneur, his success with the Macintosh was not going anywhere. And under those circumstances, the board of Apple and the CEO of Apple at the time, their tolerance for his mean man tendencies really waned, and he was eventually cast out. I think likewise what you're seeing now with the most recent scene in Silicon Valley, and that's this this, as you talked about, the tech bro scene, this what Arianna Huffington on the Uber board called brilliant jerk syndrome. We've had this incredible rush of money into Silicon Valley in recent years that's just now starting to taper off. And it really gave, it was really more money than we saw in the dot-com boom of the 90s, actually. And it really gave entrepreneurs and founders incredibly free rein, and especially in the power game between them and their investors, the venture capitalists. So it was really a buyer's market. VCs really had put little constraints in terms of culture, code of conduct on these firms. And in the process, you saw what you could probably call mean men cultures thrive. It wasn't just the guys at the top. It really has transcended throughout the whole organization. Not in the classic Steve Jobs style, I would say, but workplaces that encourage ruthless competition, sharp elbows, what they've called at Uber literally toe stepping. Don't let social cohesion get in the way of a great idea. That's kind of the mantra at Uber, and that's the company that's best known for that, but a lot of companies exude that same ethos. And it really wasn't until, the boards and investors, they've been pretty patient with that kind of approach, and it really isn't until that kind of culture blows up, as it did in the example of Uber, that they really insist on changes. I think, Kalanick, for instance, you mentioned at Uber, he, again, speaking to the money, he, when he was ousted, a lot of it was about the culture, but you could also say, in fact, it's been pretty solidly reported that it wasn't just the culture that was a problem, it was a problem with the money at Uber. Uber lost $3 billion last year. Travis Kalanick was having a hard time getting putting a control on costs. I think those are all reasons why the board lost patience with them. So, but to your point, Mark, I think I do see a shift in corporate life, and I'm not sure if it's a passing fad or not, but I think where you're seeing the change isn't all because of leadership. I think a lot of it is coming from the followership, and that's the employees. I think you're seeing today a lot more expectations from employees of their bosses than they have ever had before in terms of creating a workplace where they find meaning. And they have more means to be vocal about it. The reason Travis Kalanick was, the culture at Uber was brought out into the open was because there was a female engineer who wrote about it and posted it online. And that's how it got air, and that's how it got out there. And I think you're seeing that at other startups as well. And I think you're seeing it particularly from the millennial generation. I'm a Gen Xer, so I've spent a lot of time rolling my eyes at the millennial phenomenon, but I would say they really do bring higher expectations, certainly than my generation did, to the workforce, and greater demands. So I do think you're going to see more of that, and I think as a counterforce to the money issue is that we're also now seeing an increasing war for talent. And so companies really have to compete, and a lot of these startups have to compete. Uber has to compete for talent, and the only way they're going to get it is with not a mean man culture, I think.
Good luck to them.
Okay.
Gary.
Yes, thank you. Note that my colleagues have typewritten remarks, but I have handwritten remarks. This is my confidentiality system. Nobody can read my handwriting, and after a month, I can't either. So I'm the resident shrink on this panel, and therefore I'm not allowed to diagnose anybody I haven't seen. So, but I'm not really interested in diagnosis anyway. I'm more interested in kind of trying to figure out what makes people tick and how to understand them. And a couple of the things that Mark said, both in these remarks, but also more thoroughly in the book, led me to some comments of the psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott's, whom some of you may have heard about, mainly because he's Alison Bechdel's favorite psychoanalyst. So I'm in good company. Winnicott once commented about people with a narcissistic streak that they have a kind of double dependence. That is, they're actually quite dependent on other people to get things done, hence the controllingness we hear about. But they are also dependent on not knowing that. Because if they were to know it, their self-image would suffer, and they'd suffer the relatively toxic feeling of shame for somebody like this. This puts them in quite a bind because, as the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr once said, nothing worth doing can be done alone. So these folks are in quite a pickle because they have to depend on people. And the other thing that Winnicott said, it picks up on Zeleznik's comment about juvenile delinquency. Winnicott studied juvenile delinquents, and he also wrote a paper called Delinquency as a Sign of Hope. Bill Gates, there you go. But when he was talking about the kids he studied, he thought that the delinquent tendencies manifested themselves in a couple of kinds of behaviors. One was stealing. And from the point of view of Winnicott, who studied these kids, stealing had to do with something they had lost in terms of their maternal relationship. The other trend was aggression, and there he thought it had a lot to do with losing a father and a call for a strong father to be a container. The reason this interested me was because in Mark's book, if you read it, you'll come across a number of abandoning and a number of castrating fathers. You won't come across any mothers, interestingly, except in one place, in the very first words of the very first chapter, where Mark has an epigram that quotes someone saying, "These fighters are trying to justify their break from the mother company." Now, that's the only place you find mothers in this, but I thought Mark might have found an intuition there about the fact that something about mothers was involved with these guys. Not so much their break from mothers, but perhaps mothers with them. The other area of psychopathology that I found myself thinking about, again, no names involved here, except maybe one, is trauma. Because, you know, abusive behavior is about trauma most of the time, usually in the family history. And there's a fascinating last part to Mark's book in which he moves from a story of Adolf Eichmann to a story of the rabbi Barry Frundell, who was convicted of voyeurism. And in fact, if I can find the quote, it's really quite astonishing. This man, this very esteemed, powerful rabbi, quote, watched women in the baths. It was like a car wash, every Sunday, 6 at a time. Pairing that with the story of Adolf Eichmann, somebody like me has to hear a connection, a possible intuition in Mark's mind about the link between this man's staging of this terrible thing and his Holocaust history of the family. So I think about trauma. But I want to go back just 1 second to a couple of things. One is Marx makes a point about the fact that this kind of behavior, it may attain, but it doesn't sustain. This is one of the great quotes from the Duke basketball coach, Mike Krzyzewski. Good programs attain, great programs sustain. And Mark makes very clearly the case that this kind of behavior does not sustain. In fact, it destroys. He very intriguingly makes a number of comments about what does sustain and what creates a sustaining culture. One of them, interestingly enough, is that some of these whiz kids realize they lack something, and they're okay with that. And they hire a senior manager with experience to partner with. That's one thing. The other thing is the creation of creative teams cannot be done in a top-down way. And so there are people with sets of skills that are much more akin to a very good teacher in a classroom, or even from Winnicott's point of view, a mother cultivating the imaginative life of her child, who develop this kind of ability to bring the most out of a team. this kind of skill is a very different skill set than making critical decisions about external crises. In fact, it's much more gender-toned, and in that sense, anathema to some of the mean men. I guess the last thing I'll say is that Mark makes offers a number of suggestions to people who are stuck with this kind of leadership. And the first one is, don't take it personally. There was a very famous psychoanalyst who worked with very crazy people who offered the advice something like, guilt is a luxury therapists can't afford. That's true for anybody also in a situation like this. Don't take it personally, A. B, find a way to set a boundary. And there are various suggestions you offer about that. And I think the third thing is to find other people in the organization with whom you can sit down and reflect on your experience in your role. Because actually that experience has a lot of information in it, not only about the particular, in a sense, meanness of this boss, but what the organization might be suffering such that it's triggering the traumatic experience in that boss. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thanks, Jerry. Thank you. Sylvia.
Thank you. So as Mark mentioned, I'm a political scientist, and I found that the book offers some very insightful ideas into the consequences of various leadership approaches. And he makes a very compelling argument, as we've heard, for an alternative to meanness, for empathetic and authentic leadership. What I wanted to focus on were some of the questions about how this prescription might prove problematic, particularly for ambitious women. And from my own research, particularly for ambitious women from minority, ethnocultural, and racial backgrounds. We know about social research that shows a lot about stereotypes. And we know it's often the case that women who aspire to senior decision-making positions are often tagged as so nurturing and so cooperative and so collaborative that they can't possibly be effective leaders. And on the other side, if you read chapter 4 in Mark's book, it's an extremely insightful account about how women who operate in ways that an observer up on Mars might say would be decisive and assertive, but then gets portrayed on this planet as hormonally imbalanced, and the words go on from there. We know that there's often an additional layer of stereotyping that political scientists would see, for example, with minority women. And let's look at the treatment, for example, of former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. We know that as an African-American woman, upwardly mobile, she was depicted as not just overpowered, but also often as a sexual dominatrix, as a Jezebel who rose to the top, not because she was qualified, but rather because she was very seductive and very conniving. And this set of patterns, of course, contrasts with the opposite a trend that Marx shows. He shows us that men are permitted, they're indeed encouraged to transcend and to violate traditional gender norms by adopting a caring, sharing approach to leadership. Just think of how Presidents Clinton and Obama have operated in their role as emoters-in-chief. So my concern is, even though many of us accept and even embrace a very diverse range of behavioral repertoires for men, we're more likely to encase women leaders in a very narrow bandwidth. So I want to suggest that maybe we need to open that, stretch that wavelength wide open. In political science, there's of course the argument that the ideas about women's roles date from classical Greek philosophy, the idea of men as the public political actors, women as quiet, nurturing caregivers in a private realm. We also know that in political science, there's often a discomfort around leadership in the more directive and commanding sense of leadership associated with women leaders. And some of the research in political psychology, for example, I'll quote one of the scholars, Virginia Valian. She argues that, I quote, "The more a woman is perceived as a woman, the less likely it is that she will be perceived as professionally competent. The qualities required of leaders and those required for femininity are at odds with each other." So if we turn to examples in the political world, I just wanted to cite two examples very briefly from Canada's far north. I mean, in Canada's far north, we have examples of what ought to be the best case scenarios for women leaders on this continent, for sure. Why is that? Canada's far north includes 2 territories, the Northwest Territories and Nunavut, which operate without political parties on the basis of what is called consensus government among lawmakers. Also, the predominant populations in both territories are Aboriginal and particularly Inuit. And those populations have a very strong community commitment to what we would call authentic leadership, grassroots, listening, sharing the principles of a community in leadership, not having personal ego, informed decision making. And we've seen Inuit women lead 2 of those territories. To cut straight to the chase, if we look in the Northwest Territories, we had a woman premier from an Inuit background named Nellie Cornier. She was very strongly criticized for being both too strong and too weak. If you look at the accounts of her political career, they report that her governing style combined a collective team effort with strong personal leadership. But despite the fact that she consistently emphasized collaboration and listening, she was criticized for being tough and demanding. And at the same time, commentators said she was indecisive because she didn't weed out the people in her cabinet who weren't performing well enough, according to the commentators. In Nunavut, we saw a premier named Eva Ariak undertake a very major public consultation process with a report card that involved the entire population of the territories trying to consult, and she was condemned as too meandering, weak, and insufficiently decisive. So my question is, as people who care about the quality of public leadership, what can we do? Well, one modest proposal: what if we agree to value consultativeness as a leadership skill when it's conducted by women, not just men? Secondly, what if we stop portraying women who display what are historically masculine skill sets as deviant? That would mean we avoid the use of loaded adjectives. We heard nasty. We've also heard strident, hysterical, hormonal. When we hear discussions of women who hold power, we permit men to be assertive and proactive agents of their own destinies. What if we offered women with ambition the same range of positive descriptors? And finally, what if we decided that we would applaud courageous women who run against stereotypes, who are prepared to stand up and be decisive and ambitious and confident? So I suggest, just like we celebrate the men who hug and are empathetic and so on, perhaps we need to rethink how we gender the leadership characteristics of women in positions of responsibility. Thank you.
Thanks, Sylvia. So there's a theme that I'm picking up, and while you didn't say it, Vanessa, there was sort of embedded in my interpretation of part of what you were saying. And the theme cutting across here is, well, it's multifaceted. It's gender, but I didn't take on this thing about these guys' mothers because I didn't know where to go with it. But it was unavoidable to not keep bumping into them having fathers who emotionally or physically disappeared, and their mothers raised them or some other relative. So there's clearly a mother gender thing there. And to your comments, Sylvia, where the expectations that we put on and the acceptance of the lack of acceptance of certain leadership managerial behaviors that men are rewarded for could be tougher for a woman. And I guess I was thinking about the Uber case and how Meg Whitman was, a number 2, and why Meg Whitman? First of all, I couldn't understand why she was interested, but the commentary, I don't think I saw it in your piece, but the commentary was, she's a woman. She'll bring, softness to the culture. She will know just by virtue of her gender. And I thought, my God, this is a really very effective leader. She's not just a woman. So I'm just curious if there are other quick comments. And by the way, we've got like a pile of questions here about what about the mean women? A lot going there. Which I think not the meanness, but some of the control I have tonight is not so much to talk about. Like I want to swerve away from mean women tonight, but we can touch on it. But I'm just curious if there are any other, as we've listened to the comments around, Jerry, you could probably, certainly delve deeper into the mother-father piece, but the gender piece really, it's there. It's not avoidable. And as you said, it was a woman because of social media platforms that was able to say, here's how I was treated in an extraordinarily articulate way.
Well, I guess the thing that I'd want to underline, Mark, isn't so much about the gender issue, but the issue of the free agent. Your point, Vanessa, about the way in which the socialization now doesn't happen through going up in the company because there are all these free agents. Where does the socialization of the leader come from? And your suggestion might be a new paradigm from below, because this generation isn't so much interested in security or success, but meaning.
Well, I would be curious about another aspect of, the woman question, and that is, how do women thrive or not in a culture that is operated or established by a mean man? In your own research, what did you find in terms of the teams that coalesced around mean men? Did women thrive? Were women part of that, or did they fall by the wayside?
Typically, no, they didn't thrive. They didn't thrive. They usually were not part of those executive teams at all. I'm pausing because it goes to the big stack of questions here about what about the mean women? Because, and I want to mention this anecdotally without any real data that I know of behind it. But it might go to your point, Sylvia, where, or embedded in your point of what does a woman have to do, not just from Bion's fantasy group needs getting met. What does a woman have to do to fit in within this bro culture that is so inhospitable to potentially the way that they were raised to interact with other people? And so, I have no idea. Are these women very, very different kind of women? And I wish I could, and I would like hold up a few. Nobody comes to mind for me who has cut into that. I was about to suggest somebody, but it doesn't apply. That CEO who in your earlier years made my list, he's no longer the CEO at this organization.
I think, Mark, if we ask ourselves about the terms under which we consider meanness in women, right? I think we'd have to ask some researchers to do some measurements that establish, kind of the parameters in organizations for cooperativeness and decisiveness and so on. Because, in political life, it's very difficult to, as a woman leader, to do a lot of consulting and a lot of cooperation and still be considered a leader, right? Because then you're a follower. Because then you don't have any ideas. You're like the two women I was mentioning in Canada's far north who were seen as being indecisive because they're consultative, right? And so once they started to get more direct and make some of the decisions that we're going to follow from the consultations, then you got the arguments about being too tough, too demanding, and potentially going down this road of meanness. So I'm certainly not suggesting all women are extremely cooperative and all men are mean, but I do think that there are constraints in organizations that affect the ability of women to act in decisive ways. If we look at a field, for example, like foreign policy, women who become leaders in those fields tend to have particular kinds of personal backgrounds where their parents push them to be very poised and confident on their own from a very young age. Right? We know Madeleine Albright, for example, was responsible for a very, very young sister during the Blitz in London. During World War II, she had to take the family's ration coupons and go shopping and care for her sister in a very difficult circumstance. Right? That's just one example of expecting a young child to have a great deal of responsibility and to do it in a poised way, because it's a very dangerous circumstance, and the parents have a lot of confidence in that child's ability to do that.
So there were two questions here that are intriguing, and they feel related, so I'm going to read them both. The first one is, do mean men know they are mean? That is mean behavior conscious or deliberate? And the second question, what some may call mean, others may call passionate drive for their cause, setting aside the messy, complicated part of psychological diagnoses. How do you reconcile the difference between the two, passion and meanness? Anybody want to merge those two and take it on? Or pick off one?
Well, I don't know if I have an answer to that, but that question and your book actually brought to my mind the movie Whiplash, which I'm sure a number of you saw. And that movie just sparked this incredible debate in my mind about, is this necessary, this sadistic music teacher and his ways? And I was really intrigued that the other main character, the drummer, he bought into that himself. He believed that it was necessary to be that type of that top artist. And I think that's what you see with a lot of mean men, probably, is that they attract followers, at least in their immediate team or vicinity, who are really deeply engaged in what they do, and they want to. They also are hard charging. I'm pretty sure that's part of what their appeal is. No.
Yeah.
My guess, Mark, to come to that question is, people know passion and drive when they see it, and especially if they feel it's related to the mission of the organization, they can tolerate it. That's very different, I think, than a rageful outburst at somebody, which my hunch is those particular men are quite conscious of, but also quite automatically blaming of the other person for eliciting it.
Just want to check our friends. Thank you. Okay. There are some very strong feelings and reactions in the room. I really want to call this out, but not call the question necessarily. Strong comment and a theory, if you will, on where is the discussion of how white supremacy fuels this, with some compelling bullet points here. This is a guy I've been intrigued by. Ray, I believe his first name's Ray Dalio, CEO of Bridgewater, the largest hedge fund in the country. Dalio, CEO of Bridgewater, has just published his book celebrating the virtues of radical transparency. Is that another version of meanness? Are you familiar with Dalio? And I'm not sure if I want to suck up our time on Ray Dalio, but what he's tried to embed in the culture of Bridgewater is what he calls radical transparency, and what it looks like is absolutely brutal, immediate feedback. Brutal, and no holes barred, because he said that's the only way we can understand each other. That's the only way we can really excel. I have a reaction to that. And I know that there's been some churn going on at Bridgewater, so I don't know if what we may be starting to see is like maybe that's not a sustainable leadership theory to have this radical transparency. I don't know if organizational life can really sustain that, or the kind of people who you would attract who could be comfortable with that. What does that say in terms of the lack of diversity of thinking. Sylvia, you?
That relates to the whole question of turnover in leadership. If we look at the political realm in Canada, we've had lots of women who are the equivalent of state governors here. And those who've led major political parties spend much less time on average in office than their male comparators. There's much less patience with their making even small mistakes. And so one of the questions here about turnover and organizational stability is whether we're more willing to sort of let men maybe fix a wagon with a broken wheel, and much more likely to sort of turf the woman off the stage. And I think that would relate to this question of how much organizations are prepared to be resilient as units and patient with their leaders at the same time.
I've got one more question. We're really at time because not only have we initially exceeded the legal limit in this room, but we need to wrap up the program. Pardon me. This is an interesting question. I don't know. I think each of us can weigh in. Jerry, I know you can. What can parents do to assure that children don't become mean men? What can a child do if they're raised by mean men?
What can a child do?
If they're raised by a mean man.
Does this have to go to me?
No.
Well, I had a patient once who said to me, you know, I think the solution is locate the child within and smack it. So if you're a mean child, you know, enough of that now. But yeah, I mean, obviously, that's a long story, really. I do think, well, I think we all basically know the things kids need. Basically love, attention, limits, stability, all that, and they'll be okay.
Just personal reactions to that one?
Sure. In terms of political leaders, I think a lot of people ask political scientists, you know, what can I do to ensure my daughter, my son, you know, becomes a good citizen, a person who contributes to society, and as a public leader actually is public spirited. I think part of that is instilling the expectation that civic responsibility matters, right? That discussing what we are as a community and what we bring to our collective ethos matters, and that often starts with effective, particularly progressive politicians. It often starts around the kitchen table in the home, the discussion of public issues and the notion that we are responsible as citizens for the times in which we live.
So there was a question also here about, one was, do mean men know they're mean? And another question, can mean men change? And a third question, like, how do you coach these guys? I want to start by saying that, and I don't let this kind of developed after I completed the book, but a mean man is way on one side of a scale of pretty horrible. And on that scale, they probably would be diagnosed if a psychotherapist were to spend a significant amount of time really understanding them. They probably would be diagnosed with psychopathy. That's on one end of the scale. On the other side of the scale, somebody could be controlling, obnoxious, you just don't want to be around them, and on that side of the scale, I call them dumb and stupid, because they're developable. They can figure that out. They've got probably high adaptability. Somewhere in the middle is the kind of leader, and I use the term loosely, that my colleague at Stanford Business School writes about, Bob Sutton. And it is now a formal managerial term, assholes. And Bob wrote No Asshole Rules, and he has a book, he actually has another asshole book coming out this week. But to some extent, and I think there's somewhere between the asshole category and the full mean man, where we need to ask ourselves, can this person, do they have the capacity to adapt? Are they aware of the impact and consequences of their behavior? And my belief is far off on that scale. They may be aware of the consequences of their behavior, but they don't care. They really do not care. And what I've learned personally, and thankfully in my own practice the last number of years, I haven't had any. But for me, I stopped working with these guys. And I don't know, I don't think they're very motivated to go into therapy. I don't think they're motivated to change. There have been a couple who I've strongly tried to get another kind of help than what I could provide, but I don't work with them anymore.
Why were they motivated to work with you if they're so devoid of introspection?
Because their boards were putting pressure on them. It was all the wrong reasons. It was not coming from themselves. Their boards were putting pressure on them. The organizations were growing, and their 360s were off the charts, horrible. So the pressure was from elsewhere.
Mark, I think the question of what kind of coaching is, and if it's going to work at all, is a very, very good one. But I just want to throw in here sort of the eternal optimist. I was working with a woman who studies terrorists, and she was talking about a case of a Swedish mercenary terrorist, killed people for money. And you look at his history, terribly damaged childhood, where you could see the ways he trained himself not to feel.
Mm-hmm.
And when things all fell apart in this mercenary business, he entered a rehab program in Sweden that's designed for terrorists returning home. Now, he seemed to be changing a lot. So, who knows if it's true or how accurate or how sustained it might be, but there's always hope, I think.
Yeah. The bookend story that I have, which is in the book, but a noted psychoanalytic psychotherapist was at a teaching hospital, and he commented how residents came up to him one year and said, if we were to come back as somebody else with some clinical disorder, we want to come back as psychopaths. Life would just be so much easier. There'd be less pain, we wouldn't feel these emotions. And I didn't know what to do with that. And this eminent person clearly did not know what to do with it, but it was a fascinating piece. I'm really grateful for all of you turning out this evening. Again, it's just so touching to see so many students from literally decades ago, folks I serve on boards with, colleagues, clients, people from all facets of my life, and of course my family. So thank you all. This does not mean it's over. We've got the room longer. I've been asked to tell you what the books are. Take a left and another left, and there are books. Thank you. Join the movement. The bar is back open. There's still food.